Hello everyone. I have received several messages from traditional Muslims uh, disagreeing with what the Quran says about Prophet Muhammad. So they say that Prophet Muhammad died of natural causes, and the fact that they have historical evidence telling them that Prophet Muhammad died of natural causes. Because Quran leaves absolutely no doubt that Prophet Muhammad was killed, and Quran also tells us that Prophet Muhammad was killed by the Jews, by his contemporary Jews, the Jews of his time. However, the Quran does not tell us, or at least I have not been able to find anything in the Quran specifying how he was killed or murdered. So that begs the question for our curious minds as to how he was killed. I can tell you again, this is my conjecture. This is my reasoning from now on. This is my reasoning, my conjecture. This is not from the Quran. So take it with a grain of salt. So this is not a Quranic idea that I'm just putting forward. There are two ways to kill a person, right? Either violently through sword or attacking or assaulting that person, or through poisoning. If Prophet Muhammad had died through any act of violence, I think we would have known. I don't think that was the case. I think there was a conspiracy, a plot against Prophet Muhammad that was organized by his contemporary Jews. It doesn't mean that the Jews personally killed him, but it must have been a conspiracy. And usually back in the time, the way they used to do that was through poisoning. So that was very, very popular method. In fact, Prophet Muhammad's grandson Hassan was killed through poisoning as well. So it was very common back in the day to poison the rulers and the kings and those in the position of authority, to eliminate threats through use of poisoning. But in order to poison someone, you obviously have to have accomplices, those who help you within their household, within where they are, because you have to put the poison somewhere where they actually eat it, they trust it, they eat it, they drink it, or they use it. So I personally, again, this is my personal idea, this is my personal belief, and take it for granted and do your own research. I believe that he was poisoned to death, and obviously there was a group that conspired against our prophet, the prophet of peace and love. Of course, know that Allah allowed for that to happen. Allah gave his permission for that to happen, because Allah wanted to register Prophet Muhammad as a martyr. And I showed you the verse in chapter 3. Please watch my first video that I made about this. I'm going to put the link down below, and you can see, because it's a special privilege. Also, Prophet Muhammad's mission at that point had ended. The Quran had finished. So at that time, the mission had finished. So Allah allowed for that to happen. But let's peek through the history. We're going to look at the time about 300 years after the Prophet. We're going to look at that time period. We're going to peek through the history and see what the people at that era, at that time, which is about 300 years after the Prophet, when Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim were written, what those people were thinking, what did they believe happened, and what was the circumstances of Prophet Muhammad's death according to the people in about 300 years after the Prophet. We're going to peek through that history. It's not going to tell us the exact detail. We can never find the exact details in Hadith, but we're going to see some interesting ideas. So bear with me for the next few minutes, and you're going to be surprised. you're really going to be surprised. And you're going to see actually majority of the people at that time, at about 300 years after the Prophet, actually knew and believed that Prophet Muhammad had been poisoned to death. Okay, so the first hadith we're going to look at is Sahih Bukhari. Again, I'm not going to go through everything. I'm just going to read it very quickly for the sake of time. If I ask you something, so the Prophet is talking to the Jews. If I ask you something, will you tell me the truth? They replied, yes. He asked, have you put the poison in this roasted sheep? So they replied, yes. He asked, what made you do that? They replied, we intended to learn if you were a liar, in which case we would be relieved from you. And if you were a prophet, then it would not harm you. So for some reason, I want you to know Satan, Lucifer, Iblis, the great demon Akbar, had put it in the hearts of the Jews at that time and even before that, that when whoever claims a prophet, kill him. If you can kill him, that person is not a prophet. If you can't kill him, then that person is a prophet. What a convenient way for Lucifer and his followers to kill and murder Allah's prophets. And that's why they killed so many prophets. This is another hadith. This is from Sunan Abi Dawud. And you can see that this is a Sahih hadith. It says, Mubashir was the mother of one of the Ansar, one of the companions of the Prophet, who actually died from the poisoning, just so you know. So she said to the Prophet during the sickness of which he died. So Prophet was sick at this point, according to this hadith. What do you think about your illness, Messenger of Allah? I do not think about the illness of my son, her son, except the poisoned sheep of which he had eaten with you at Khaybar. The Prophet at this point says that I do not think about my illness except that either. So the Prophet believed, according to this hadith, that he is sick because of that poison that he had. This is the time when it cut off my aorta. Let's look at another hadith, again Sunan Abu Dawud. Again, you can see this is Sahih hadith. It says, so a Jewess presented him, the Prophet, at Khaybar with a roasted sheep which she had poisoned. The Messenger of Allah ate of it, and the people also ate. He then said, take away your hands from the food. At this point, he has eaten the food, for it has informed me that it is poisoned. Bishr ibn al-Abara ibn Marur al-Ansari died. So this is the son that the mother was talking about, right? So he sent for the Jewess. The Prophet sent for the Jewess and said to her, what motivated you to do the work you have done? She said, if you were a prophet, it would not harm you, but if you were a king, I should rid the people of you. The Messenger of Allah then ordered regarding her, and she was killed in this hadith. He then said about the pain of which he died. I continued to feel pain from the morsel which I had eaten at Khaybar. This is the time when it had cut off my aorta. So again, basically, this hadith tells us that the Prophet actually ate a poisoned food and died of that later. So again, you cannot get the exact details because this is 300 years after the Prophet. But it tells you that people at 300 years after the Prophet believed and knew that Prophet Muhammad had been poisoned to death. Now the details, that's something else. This is another hadith from Sahih al-Bukhari. Again, says the Prophet in his ailment in which he died used to say, "O Aisha, I still feel the pain caused by the food I ate at Khaybar. And at this time, I feel as if my aorta is being cut from that poison." Now, this is another hadith from Sahih Muslim. This is Sahih Muslim and Sahih Bukhari are the Bible of traditional Muslims, right? So Anas reported that the Jews came to Allah's messenger with poisoned mutton, and he took of that what had been brought to him. So he ate it. When the effect of, so he ate the poison. So it's telling us, again, we are looking at several of them. He ate the poison, and when the effect of this poison were felt by him, he called for her. So he got sick. At this point, he has had the poison. He's sick. And he called for her and asked her about that. Whereupon she said, "I had determined to kill you." Thereupon he said, "Allah will never give you the power to do that." He said that The companion said, should we not kill her? Thereupon he said, no. He said, Anas said, I felt the effects of this poison on the palate of Allah's messenger in his mouth. It's like he saw basically that he witnessed that he had the poison and the poison was burning through his throat and everything. So this is Sahih Muslim. Again, this is another hadith from Sunan Abi Dawud. Again, you can see that this is a Sahih hadith. The Prophet liked the foreleg of a sheep. Once the foreleg was poisoned, and he thought that the Jews had poisoned him. And then again, another hadith from Sahih Bukhari, a Jewess brought a poisoned sheep for the Prophet, who ate from it. So again, he ate from it. It's not that he actually ate the poisoned food. So this is as a deadly poison. They had put the poison on it and he actually ate from it. She was brought to the Prophet and he was asked, shall we kill her? He said, no. And then he says, I continue to see the effect of the poison on the palate of the mouth of Allah's apostle. Again, these are hadiths. These are sayings. This is not from the Quran. Quran tells us 100% that Prophet Muhammad was killed by the Jews of his own time. That was a mission that they had not completed. They had to complete that by killing Prophet Muhammad. So he was the martyr of the Lord. However, the Quran does not tell us how. So that's why we are peeking through the historical narratives to see what we can gather. So considering that Prophet Muhammad was killed, by the Jews, murdered and martyred by the Jews, we can see how. So there was a common belief amongst the believers at about 300 years after the Prophet that our Prophet of peace and love was poisoned to death by the Jews. And I argue that if someone is poisoned to death, there are probably some accomplices in people around him as well. It's very unlikely that someone can poison someone so easily, especially someone of that caliber, someone in that high position of power. So I don't pay really much attention. I want you to know to the details of this, that it happened in Khaybar, that it happened that Prophet died a few years after. I don't believe that was the case. I believe Prophet Muhammad at the end of his last few days was poisoned, and due to poisoning, he passed away. And remember, it's very difficult to distinguish between the effects of poisoning versus the effect of being sick. They have very, very similar symptoms, unless you have actually labs and diagnostics like we do nowadays. So if that this had happened in our day and age, we would do a blood draw, and we would do tests, and we would realize what is in his blood. Is it arsenic? Is it what kind of poison is there in his blood? But back in the day, they didn't have those capabilities. So the person who is poisoned back in the day would present with similar symptoms like fever. He would be hallucinating because the poison had difficulty breathing, and a lot of these things that even quite frankly, some viruses present with similar symptoms as well. So that's why you have some disagreement amongst the believer, because some believers, they're like, oh, he's a prophet of God. You can't, again, just having learned that from the Jews, he would say he cannot be killed. So therefore, that was a natural death. And then there's another group that actually believe what Prophet, according to these hadiths, said himself that he was poisoned to death. So they believe that they know that he was poisoned. Quran makes it very clear that he was killed. That tells us basically that Prophet Muhammad was undoubtedly poisoned to death by a conspiracy organized and led by his contemporary Jews. Now, we don't know who else was involved in that, of course. Remember, the act of poisoning is not just one person poisons someone to death. Usually cases like this, there's conspiracy. You can't kill an important person like Prophet Muhammad, who is a ruler, who is a governor, who is a prophet, who is a messenger, without having accomplices, without having some people who help you in it. And you have to remember what happened to Islam after Prophet Muhammad. The religion was completely changed. Prophet Muhammad was never out to conquer the world. Islam was never supposed to be an imperialistic religion. None of Allah's religions are imperialistic. We don't have a stronger, more powerful king and ruler than Prophet Solomon. His armies were composed of the jinn, of the birds, animals, things like that. He had powers. Back in the day, he had his own kind of an airplane. If you read the stories in the Quran, he could had flying. The wind would take him. So we don't know what kind of equipment he had. But he had powers that was, even nowadays, it's that kind of a power is non-existent. But Solomon never set out, Prophet Solomon never set out to conquer the world. He never conquered Rome or Persia or China. He never did that because Allah's religion is not supposed to be imperialistic. It's a religion of peace. It's a religion of tranquility. There is no compulsion. La ikraha fid din. No compulsion in religion. It's a religion that is supposed to bring peace for humanity, not war and bloodshed. So the question is, what happened after Prophet Muhammad? So we know Prophet Muhammad was trying to capture Mecca. There was a reason for that. Prophet Muhammad's hometown was Mecca. He and his companions were kicked out of Mecca. Their wealth, their belonging, everything was captured in an unjust manner. It was an injustice. It was an oppression. So Prophet Muhammad righted that wrong. He wanted to go back home. That was his homeland. And also he wanted to open the way of pilgrimage so that true believers could perform pilgrimage. So that's why he captured Mecca. And if you look at the history of the wars, they were constantly being attacked. So he was defending against the invaders on a constant basis. But at the time of Prophet Muhammad, he never set out to capture different countries and expanding his territory and creating an empire. That was not the case. So what happened after Prophet Muhammad? You have to know that there were people in that group, and Allah talks about it. In the people around him, Allah talks about it in the Quran, there were munafiqun, the hypocrites. These were people that were pretending to be believers. They were pretending to be the followers of the Quran, but they were not. They were munafiqun. They were actually the enemies of Allah and His Messenger. Allah talks about samma'un lil-kadhib. They were the spies, the Jewish spies that existed back then amongst the ranks of the believers. So those things happened, and that's why you have to know what kind of people the Prophet was surrounded by. And that's why it's very important for us to know this, because that explains, this knowledge explains what happened actually after the Prophet and the events that occurred after him. And there was so much bloodshed during those wars, attacking different countries, different nations, killing so many people, enslaving their population, bringing back and so. That is not what Allah wants. This religion is the religion of peace. Islam is submission, is peace. Not exporting terror, not exporting war and bloodshed to other nations, other people, enslaving them, to sell them in the markets and make money off of people's sons and daughters and wives. That's not it. So you have to know this to realize what happened after Islam and why it changed so much, why it turned into this imperialistic religion. Exactly the same thing happened in Christianity about a few hundred years after Christ as well. And you have to always compare that to the rule of David and Solomon, who were the most powerful kings of Israel, and they had this angelic army supporting them, but they never set out to do things like that. And you never hear about David or Solomon causing bloodshed, because they were the prophets that actually died of natural causes. And they were alive, they led the armies, things like that. So then if you compare these, you understand that Prophet Muhammad's mission was the same, because Allah doesn't change. Allah's ways are the same, they don't change, okay? And then you understand what happened and why this changed so much. That's why it's so important. Peace and blessings to all of you.